Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our plastic packaging tax webinar. My name is Christian Crawford. I'm a senior audit manager here at Bishop Fleming and a member of the food and drink team. I also sit on the Regional Sustainability Committee for the Institute of Chartered Accountants and champion sustainability here at Bishop Fleming. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues Isabel Savage and Fleur Lewis. Isabel is a tax partner and member of our manufacturing team and one of our R&D experts, and Fleur heads up our food and drink team. Now, it feels like the plastic packaging tax has been a long time in the coming after first being announced back in 2018. And HMRC have been quite slow in sort of finalising the final details of how exactly the tax is going to work. So much so, I know the last update came out only last month, and given that it's coming into force in April, there's nothing like leaving it to the last minute at HMRC. But the main reason for that is that it's got some very complex elements to it in terms of practicality, and the tax itself is very intricate. And also, given its more operational nature, we're delighted to invite Ecosurety back to help you guide through the latest updates. And I'm delighted to welcome John Brooks, who's Head of Partnerships at Ecosurety, and Louisa Goodfellow, who is a Policy Advisor. John and Louisa are also joined by Alice Flavin, who is a Business Development Manager at Ecosurety. Those of you who joined us for our plastic packaging tax webinar last year may remember John and Louisa, and today they'll be able to provide you all the latest updates around the tax, what you as businesses need to do next and how best to prepare, and finally how best to mitigate risk and maximise those opportunities that the tax presents. I'm sure many of you will have questions, so do pop those in the Q&A section and we'll try to run through as many of those as we can towards the end. If we can't get through all of them, please do attach your name to them so we can follow up afterwards. As usual, all the documents and helpful resources will be shared after the event, and the webinar is being recorded for you to watch again at your leisure. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to John and to give you all the latest on the tax. So John, over to you.
Thanks, Christian. Hi, everyone. Can't quite believe it was nearly a year ago that we did this, and we're only just getting full details of how the tax is going to work. So absolutely 11th hour stuff, as you said, Christian. So yeah, really great to be here. I'm just going to give a very quick overview of Ecosurety. Some of you might be familiar with this, but it's worth just framing that context as to why we've got anything useful and interesting to share alongside Bishop Fleming on the plastics tax. So Alice, if you could just click to the next slide for the agenda. So I'm just going to do a quick overview and then I'll hand over to Louisa, who's our policy expert, and she's going to take you through the details of the tax and what we know and how it will work, and then pass back over to Alice and myself, and we're just going to talk a little bit about the risks and opportunities from the data required. And as Christian pointed out, it's very operational in its nature, so hopefully there's some useful things that we can share there from our experience from what we're doing with our customers at the moment, and then there'll be an opportunity for a Q&A. So Alice, if you could just click through the next slide if you want to just complete the whole picture. I won't spend long boring you too much about Ecosurety, but it is useful context hopefully as to our expertise and the kind of work that we're doing. So fundamentally we operate in producer responsibility. We are a purpose-led organisation, and we've always focused on how we can try and make a positive impact. So you know, why we get out of bed in the morning is really about that, and it's about accelerating change to an environmentally sustainable world. So we do that through lots of mechanisms, but it's all about collaborating with brands, manufacturers, retailers, other industry experts in the recycling space to help make more sustainable product and packaging decisions. And using data and insights in various ways gives us a great opportunity to be able to do that. So that's quite relevant to the plastics tax because it's a bit of a blunt instrument, but there are some opportunities that we're already starting to see from prior to it even being implemented that are starting to drive some positive change, albeit lots of challenges as well. Just click to the next slide, please. And yeah, very quickly. So we're a producer responsibility organisation. We operate compliance schemes for packaging, also waste electricals and batteries. So our bread and butter really is in the detail of packaging data and helping organisations comply with regulation. Up until now, that hasn't been plastics tax, but there are lots of similarities, and we'll come on to that a little bit later. But you've got an expert team of data analysts, policy team, and you'll hear from Louisa in a second. And we work with a multitude of various organisations. So what we'll hope to share with you is a bit of insight from some of the things that we're helping different organisations with, which might be useful for you to look at in your own organisations and replicate, and we're very happy to help. And then finally, if you just click to the last slide from the introduction, we became a B Corp certified business 2 years ago now, I think, and that was a bit of a sort of rubber stamp as to our credentials and our values as a business. So whilst there's lots of commerciality around plastics tax and lots of operational headaches that we focus our energy and resources and expertise on, it's all really about how can we use those mechanisms, how can we use regulation to ultimately get to a better environmental output through different materials, increasing recycled content. So that's really what we're sort of geared towards. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Louisa, who's going to take you through the tax.
Thanks, Sean, and good morning, everyone. So I'm going to go over what we kind of know from the lens of what a liable taxpayer should be kind of considering at this point. As was mentioned earlier, there's been quite a lot of updates from HMRC in the last few months. So I'd say we have a bit more clarity around the tax at this point. Still a few questions that need to be answered though. So I'll get straight in. Just going back to basics in terms of kind of which businesses are liable to pay the tax. You need to pay the tax if you've manufactured in the UK or imported more than 10 tonnes of finished plastic packaging within the last 12 months, or will do so in the next 30 days. These are the two kind of tests of liability that HMRC have outlined, and I'll go into a bit more detail on them later. But for liable producers, it's worth emphasising here that the PPT is due on plastic packaging when it's finished, but importantly, before the pack filling process. So HMRC class a component as finished when it's undergone its last substantial modification. But as I said, if this happens as part of the pack filling process, then the tax point is triggered at the last substantial modification, but before that one. So in terms of what substantial modification is defined as, it's anything that changes the shape, structure, thickness or weight of a component. So this might include activities like moulding or extrusion, but won't include things such as cutting or kind of blowing a preform. HMRC have published a list of processes that won't count as modifications, so kind of this aspect of the tax is slightly clearer at this point in terms of when the tax point exactly is. In terms of domestic manufacturing supply chains, that's I've gone over on the first column in the slide. This means that businesses, it's quite important that businesses communicate their activities on a given production run of packaging, because hopefully you can see how the tax could be, it could be paid twice. If a manufacturer is supplying onto a business who substantially modifies the packaging, and both companies think they are liable, there is a risk of the tax being paid twice. In terms of imports, the point of liability is perhaps slightly clearer. So if you're an importer of plastic packaging, which is already finished, and this is filled or unfilled packaging, then you'll be liable to pay the tax. Just a note on who is the liable importer for the tax. HMRC will assume in the first instance that it's the consignee on the importation documents, unless a business provides evidence otherwise. So if you are a company that imports plastic packaging and you use a freight forwarder or some sort of courier company, and they are listed on the importation document, you need to provide evidence directly to Treasury to say that you're the owner of the packaging and liable for the tax. So just to reiterate on this slide, because it's kind of a problem that we've encountered when we're talking to our members and customers, that for both kind of domestic packaging supply chains and importers, it's quite crucial at this stage to identify that last substantial modification. and that this is communicated along the supply chain, both to ensure compliance with the tax, of course, but also to ensure that everyone knows exactly what they're liable for and therefore kind of not paying the tax unnecessarily or double paying. Cool. So if I could have the next slide, please, Alice. Thank you. So which plastic packaging is subject to the tax? There are broadly two types of packaging that will be taxable, and these are packaging components for use in the supply chain and also single-use packaging that's sold onto a consumer. But I'll emphasise here that the tax is charged when a component of a piece of packaging is finished. So this means, for instance, that a plastic film wrapper will be charged separately to a plastic label that's stuck onto it to complete that piece of packaging. So as a liable business, you'll need to account for each component of plastic packaging as opposed to what you might consider to be the finished item. This said, however, if a plastic packaging component is made from multiple materials but contains more plastic by weight than any other substance, it will be classed as plastic packaging component for purposes of the tax. But equally, if the reverse is true, for instance, there's a cardboard element and that's heavier than the plastic element, then it won't be classed as plastic at all and therefore not liable for the tax. So this kind of stipulation essentially targets pieces of packaging like cartons or pouches, not pieces of packaging that are just made up of several components when they're finished. So so there's a definition. HMRC have outlined their legal definition of packaging, and for it to be classed as packaging, either needs to contain goods, protect them, handle them, present them, or deliver them. So this actually does include things that might not immediately seem like packaging, such as like labels or cling film. And it's also worth noting that for those of you who are compliant with the Packaging Producer Responsibility Regulations, or also known as the PRN system, the list of in and out of scope packaging differs between those two regimes. So, for instance, plastic bags are out of scope of the packaging regs, but they are chargeable for plastic packaging tax. So the alignment of packaging, there is a misalignment of packaging between the two regulations. Last point on this slide is that I would say that for new regulations like this, it can be quite tricky at first to kind of scope less common pieces of packaging or to work out whether items are even classed as packaging. But HMRC have started to compile a list of examples, which can be quite useful to refer to. Can I have the next slide, please, Alice? Thank you. So although we've just talked about what HMRC define as packaging, there are 4 categories of packaging exempt from the tax. They're products used for the immediate packaging of licensed human medicines, products permanently set aside for non-packaging use, transit packaging around imports, and packaging used in air, ship and rail goods stores. I'll point out here that if your company does deal with any of these types of packaging, the packaging around licensed human medicines and packaging that's permanently set aside for another use does still count towards the 10 tonne a year registration threshold. So will need to be recorded, whereas the other 2 exemptions don't, and therefore you don't need to keep records of them. I guess the most relevant here will be the transit packaging around imports exemption, and it's probably worth going into a bit more detail because it's quite a tricky one to define, and also there's been a lot of queries about it. But essentially this exemption applies to only the outermost tertiary packaging that a shipping company, for instance, might apply to their consignments. So it could be pallet wrap around a big consignment of goods. There have the kind of 2 clear conditions for this exemption that must be met. So the packaging must group together a number of sales units and must exclusively protect the goods during shipment. So, for instance, a plastic box around 10 sales units that have their own packaging around them, that wouldn't be classed as transit packaging, that would just be classed as normal secondary packaging. So it's more about how the packaging is used as opposed to the actual product itself. So in reality, it's quite a narrow exemption in terms of the tonnage that will be exempt under this. Moving on to the exclusions, the difference here being that they don't actually come under HMRC's definition of packaging, as opposed to being specifically exempted. There are 3 types of products excluded from the tax. These don't need to be included when working out the total weight of packaging manufactured or imported, so don't need to be included on returns. Just to give a few examples, the first one, products used in long-term storage of goods, that could be toolboxes or CD cases. Products that are integral part of the good could be inhalers or printer cartridges, and products that are reused for the presentation of goods are things like shop display shelves. So again, with all of these things, there is kind of room for interpretation, and if you're having trouble figuring it out, if you're figuring out if your item is kind of in or out of scope, as I mentioned, HMRC are developing a list of examples that they will kind of continually add to their guidance. So hopefully we'll have at some point a long list of examples to refer to. Could I have the next slide, please, Alice? Thank you. So once you've identified you are liable to pay the tax, you must know the weight of the packaging component, and that needs to be recorded in kilograms, and the percentage of recycled plastic content in order to submit your quarterly returns. So these processes need to be, as I've mentioned, at a component tree level, and also updated if packaging specifications you handle change at any point. So essentially accurately gaining the weight of packaging you're liable for is obviously important for returns, as I mentioned, and it will also be used to work out how much actual tax is due at the end of each quarter. So to work out the overall weight of a component, you can use kind of any of these methods listed on the slide. And in fact, if none of these methods are suitable, you can actually apply to use a different method, and HMRC will have to approve that on the information that you've provided. But if we just go through just a few examples, perhaps the most practical is the sample component method. So this is obviously where you would take some samples of a finished packaging component, and given that they all weigh the same, you can then take an average weight per component for your reporting. Worth noting that HMRC will expect you to keep records of this activity, and we're hoping for a bit more detail on what records will be acceptable soon. Lastly, if we just look at the verified specification method, possibly would be the most useful for importers. Here you can use the weights given on a product specification from a manufacturer, but HMRC have stated you must also weigh a random selection of components to make sure that they match the spec, and can and again keep records of this. In terms of imports though, this can be done by the overseas manufacturer, so it would be a case of getting that paperwork and evidence from them. So like a lot of aspects of this tax, HMRC also kind of expect some level of due diligence from companies, just to add to the requirements. In the interest of time, I won't go over the due diligence in detail here, but it's worth having a look at the requirements in the guidance, because they are expecting companies to carry it out. Could I have the next slide, please, Alice? Thank you. Excuse me. So on to recycled content then. Again, I'm not going to cover what is classed as recycled plastic here, but you can find definitions of recycled plastic on the gov.uk website. So essentially, the calculation of recycled content is a mass balance approach. So you'll divide the weight of recycled plastic used by the combined total weight of all plastic used, and then multiply that outcome by 100. And this is, of course, again, at a componentry level, as opposed to, say, the combined total of a plastic bottle and its cap and its label. So all 3 components would have to have this calculation applied to them separately. So I know in the previous slide we went over approved methods for calculating the weight of packaging on your returns. But if you need to calculate the weight of recycled and non-recycled plastic used in a component, then you must either use what's called a material input method, which essentially looks at raw material put in and then the output of recycled content that comes out. Or again, you can use this verified specification method. And if you plan on using specifications from a manufacturer, kind of as evidence of recycled content, once again, due diligence needs to be carried out if importing from overseas. So I think if we move on, yes, so onto registration. Registration will open from the 1st of April. You must register for the tax if you reach this 10-tonne annual threshold I mentioned in the first slide. Looking in a bit more detail at the liability to register tests. So there's 2 tests for this. You both need to look back over the last 12 months and also look forward to the next 30 days. And HMRC recommends that you kind of track this quite frequently, especially if you're a small business just around that 10-tonne threshold per annum threshold. Worth noting that the forward-looking test takes precedent. So if you get a large order for the next month, that means you'll exceed 10 tonnes per year importing or manufacturing, but you haven't exceeded that in the last 12 months, you need to register as you've had this order, albeit the order hasn't been completed yet. So registration does include non-UK resident taxpayers who import finished packaging into the UK or manufacture finished plastic packaging in the UK. So it's not limited to UK-based businesses. Also, if you're kind of part of a partnership or another kind of unincorporated body, you must register if at least one partner is liable to pay the tax. But you can register as a group if there's a number of businesses underneath an umbrella company. So one business under that umbrella company will be nominated and they'll be responsible to pay tax on behalf of the whole group. Once you've become liable for the tax, then you'll have 30 days to register from the actual date, from the exact date, I should say, that you meet or exceed the threshold. Obviously, as the tax starts on the 1st of April of this year, the backward-looking test works a little bit differently between the 1st of April of this year and the 30th of March of next year, as there won't have been a 12-month period to look back to since the tax begun. So you just need to look back to the 1st of April. Any packaging that's been imported or manufactured in this financial quarter or Q1 doesn't count towards the tax at all. So when you do come to register, you'll need to provide the information. Sorry, Alice, if I could just back to the previous slide. It's only got a few more sentences. Thank you. You'll need to provide the information listed on the slide. Just a note on the customer reference number. This isn't a unique number generated for plastic packaging tax, but is instead like an existing one that your company will probably hold anyway. So it could be a corporation tax reference or a company reference number. But we're kind of hoping that once registration opens on the 1st of April, the process is quite self-explanatory and can be done quite quickly on the HMRC online portal that they are developing currently. Cool. So we can go on to records and accounts, please, Alice. Thank you. So once you're registered for the tax, you must keep accounts and records to support the information that you submit on your quarterly tax returns. So basically, the accounts show how you've worked out the figures that you submit on your return, and then records have to be kept that essentially evidence those figures that you submit. So where relevant, we know that the accounts should show the weight of finished packaging for each quarter, the weight of any packaging that's been exported, which I'll talk over briefly in a minute, and also any adjustments that need to be made to the previous accounting period. And this information broadly follows what you'll need to report on your return, essentially, and again needs to be kept by product line, which might have quite a bit of admin involved, but you can't just look at the total company. It has to be by product line of packaging, imported or manufactured. So records then, or essentially evidence types, they must show kind of evidence of any exemptions from the tax, such as packaging that's used around licensed human medicines, and must also evidence the recycled plastic content if it's over 30%. So I think in the next slide, please, Alice, I'm going to briefly talk over the process for exporting. So for those of you that do go on to export plastic packaging, you may be able to defer the liability to pay the tax, or you can claim tax back on your tax return as a credit. And this credit system applies to either exported packaging or packaging that you can prove has later been converted into a new component. So if we look back at the first column, you can defer payment of the tax by up to 12 months on packaging you know will be exported within that time. And of course, records must be kept of this. So in the first instance, to start that deferral process, you need to keep documents used either for the documents that are either used for any other tax or duty, or which clearly identify the components that will be exported. So this could be something like a sales contract. These documents do need to identify and date the exact kind of batch of components of plastic packaging. Hopefully you might have that kind of information in your business anyway. If not, you'll have to have a think about finding documents that identify and date the plastic packaging. To then go on and cancel that liability, once the goods have left the UK, you need to provide evidence that the export has taken place, the weight of the packaging and the date of export. And there is more information again on the HMRC website about this. So the website does give some examples of evidence types that could be used to prove this. If you decided instead to claim a credit, again, you'll need to emphasise the reason for the claim, and also the details of the tax that you already paid on the components, such as the date and how much tax was actually paid. Equally, if the component was exported, you'll need to keep the same kind of evidence I discussed in the deferral process. And as an example, these kind of documents could be bills of lading or consignment notes, just as long as they have the right identifying information on them. Just to note that this is another area we found where things could get quite confusing along supply chains. So if a UK manufacturer makes packaging and their customer goes on to export it, that customer can't claim a credit or ask for a deferral on payment. It will have to be the original taxpayer who does that. So the manufacturer in this example would need to give evidence of export, would need to get evidence of export from their customer in order to get the tax back. So again, this kind of communication along the supply chain will be really important, because it will also kind of be mutually beneficial, as it could keep costs down for everyone by ensuring that the tax isn't paid unnecessarily. So I think I've got my last slide now, please, Alice. Yeah, so this is just a bit of a concluding slide, really. I know we've talked a lot about gaining evidence for the tax and keeping records alongside all of the accounts too, because that is kind of the most pressing issue for businesses right now, is trying to gather all of this data and paperwork. So listed are examples of kind of acceptable evidence or paperwork, if you like, that you could be gathering ahead of April that HMRC we know will accept. So to take a few examples, As I've mentioned, product specifications could be used to prove the recycled content of the packaging, or the weight of components that you'll be liable for, or evidence of any exemptions. As I said earlier, HMRC are expecting a degree of due diligence work, information of which can be found on the website, but it's important that it's done as it gives kind of both reassurance to you and lessens the chance of being found secondarily liable if a business in your supply chain fails to pay the tax. So product specifications seem to be quite a good evidence stream if you can get them, because they kind of tick quite a lot of boxes. Just take one more example. For instance, sales and purchase invoices then could be used to evidence the amount of recycled plastic that's been used, the quantities of supplied plastic packaging components, or the date of sale. So just to finish then, it's worth checking the most up-to-date guidance to ensure you're kind of gathering the right kind of information and data. And although I haven't explicitly gone over it, there is some information up on the website about submitting returns too. Obviously, the first returns will be kind of submitted in July of this year, after the second financial quarter. So the first step is to start gathering evidence and data, and also ensuring you have all the information to be able to register after the 1st of April. So that's me done. I think I'm going to pass over back to John or Alice. Thank you.
I think over to Alice. You're on mute, I think.
Great, thanks. It had to be someone. Yeah, so I thought I'd start with this slide, which sort of, I guess, just gives you a sort of a total picture of some of the legislation. Obviously, plastic packaging tax is there, but sort of other legislations that, you know, are kind of on a lot of companies' agendas. So yeah, it's just sort of I thought obviously we're going to focus on plastic packaging tax legislation, but if you need sort of further information on sort of a related legislation, which is extended producer responsibility, then, you know, sort of feel free to reach out to us. So yeah, I guess a lot of the pressure for producers is sort of around these data requirements that are needed for plastic packaging tax. And this data you haven't asked from producers before, and a lot of the work is around sort of the education and retrieval of that information. So today we're just going to provide you with an overview of sort of the process that we've typically taken with producers to help prepare them for the tax in sort of the most efficient way. And I think it's really important just to make the point that data is really integral to parts of getting right. And the reason for this is that you want to make sure that you're paying the right costs, and so I'm sort of going to sort of touch on that today, and happy to sort of take any questions or have any sort of follow-up conversations.
I think the other thing just to point out on that slide in terms of regulation is that there's all these overlapping requirements, and what we're starting to see with lots of the customers that we're dealing with is that you're starting to have converging requirements on different stakeholders in the business. So where you might have had PRNs or packaging producer responsibility requirements sat somewhere else in the business, usually tagged onto a load of other stuff, and it's a big headache. And you've had tax sitting with finance teams. We're starting to see, those things kind of converging, and it's worth just being really aware of them if you're not, because you don't want to be duplicating work, because there's some things that Alice will come on to now where you can really kind of join up efforts. Thanks, Alice.
Thanks. So I'd just like to talk you through, I guess, the risks to having bad quality data for plastic packaging tax, and subsequently sort of the opportunities that good data for plastic packaging tax can offer, because these types of things that kind of can be seen sort of as a hindrance, as a frustration, but actually the data that you'll need to report against the tax could actually present some really good future opportunities for your company. So firstly, I guess not having good data for plastic packaging tax, it can really sort of lead to sort of a lot of changes in your challenges in your business. So for example, if you don't have good data, then you don't really have the ability to do sort of further analysis, using that real-time data to make tangible decisions on things such as recycled content and introducing that into your packaging, or where does that benefit both for your environmental targets, but also where does that make an impact on reducing those costs. And then you can also really dig deeper if you've got really good data that's needed for the tax. Just seeing where that's being derived from. So how are the sort of the direct and the indirect cost split, which products are driving those costs, and really just to sort of have that ability to engage your supply chain, can sort of be limited. Obviously, naturally, there's going to be more beneficial outputs to having good data, and sort of just to name a few here. So to have good data allows you to really have those strategic conversations with your suppliers, to give them sort of, I guess, the data and the statistics to make better decisions with the packaging that they're supplying you with. It really allows you to be assured that you're paying the accurate costs as well, and not overpaying. And on top of that, engaging with your customers as well on the improvements that you're making to mitigate the packaging that you're supplying to them, because inevitably we're seeing that more and more, where a lot of brands or distributors are being asked how are they making those changes. So the type of data needed also sort of allows you to report towards any plastic targets or environmental targets that you put in place more effectively. So for example, if you're registered with the UK Plastic Pact, run by WRAP, these have kind of similar targets in terms of reporting, or sort of have targets that require sort of the data that you'll be needing for plastic packaging tax. And a lot of these data requirements as well are needed for plastic packaging tax, are needed for extended producer responsibility, and so those kind of two legislations interlink, and something that we can provide further information on. So yeah, sort of overall, by making sure that you've kind of got that high quality, accurate database, it allows for sort of better interaction with your supply chain, and really report effectively against targets, and help to minimise future costs. So just this slide provides a snapshot of a typical process that we've taken with we take with our members, to sort of help them on that journey to that good database that has all the data and requirements needed. So some producers don't need help in all of these areas, and some do. And so just today I'm going to go through a case study of a member that we've worked with. I'm not going to sort of name that member, but it's sort of the concept around that type of business and kind of how we applied this data process. So this producer's previously had some data for the producer responsibility regulations. So they already had some weight information by SKU level, but their packaging weight information wasn't by componentry level, and they had various different brand divisions that were providing various different formats for the data, which kind of led to confusion and was quite difficult for them to kind of see where their costs would lie, and kind of collecting that information into one central place. So firstly, we kickstarted a project to collect that information for them from suppliers. So as well as sort of bringing up the coverage of historic packaging data, we asked those suppliers, providing them with sort of a standardised template with all the data requirements that are needed for plastic packaging tax. And collecting that information from them and putting that into a central database for them, and auditing that data. So looking for sort of discrepancies in that data, so that we can really build a high quality database for that client. And once we were comfortable with that level of data, we were able to start looking at extracting this data and providing better insights to the client, how they could make improvements. So for example, we made a specific dashboard on plastic packaging tax and provided them with sort of a total picture of their packaging portfolio and the high level cost, but then really drilled into how those suppliers, those product divisions and their packaging were driving those costs, so that they could then we could then advise them on how to mitigate those costs for the future and sort of highlight any data improvements. However, obviously these types of insight tools can only really be driven by good coverage of data, but it's definitely something that we start with and we support our clients with. So yeah, feel free to get in contact with us if sort of any of these areas resonate with you, and we'd be happy to advise on that. Right, pass over to John.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. So I'm just going to fairly briefly, just in the interest of time, show you an example of one of the analytical tools that we've developed. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully it'll work. I think the really important point that Alice made in terms of the accuracy of data and having the right coverage and kind of building on the points that Louisa went through. And we've seen, practical examples of where companies are going to needlessly have to pay thousands and thousands of pounds of a plastic packaging tax because at the moment the data they have on what they're exporting or what their customers are exporting is estimated. And so we're able to kind of really hone in on that area as kind of low hanging fruit with them to say, look, if we improve the accuracy of your data in this area, you can save X. So that's something just worth being aware of is the piece around having that accurate data, which will also unlock other opportunities, is really important. So this is just an example of a dashboard that we've built where all of that data set will feed into, and you can do all sorts of different modelling and insights. This is just an overview page, and you can see that you've got plastic packaging tax here, but then also we've got other associated dashboards I won't go into today, where it's linking up modelling extended producer responsibility fees and greenhouse gas emissions. So where you start to be able to model different scenarios, for example, in scenario 3 here, where in this example, it's modelling changing from plastic bottles to aluminium cans. And so you can see that the plastics tax here reduces in scenario 3, so the cost is much lower. But if you go over to the carbon impacts, it's much higher. So you can start to be able to make those kind of strategic decisions of saying, right, well, we might tick one environmental box over here by increasing plastic or reducing plastic or changing format, but actually is that the best result, from an environmental standpoint? So, there's lots of focus rightly on plastic, as there has been, and a lot of sort of hysteria around it. But I think companies are starting to now get a bit clued into where does it sit in the overall environmental picture and your ESG agenda or other commitments. So on the plastic packaging tax, there's lots of analysis that you can do, and in this tool it helps to kind of give an overview, so you can start to split, and you can change these depending on your business. But in this example, it's looking at category, so where are the biggest cost drivers, and then from costs, if you look at cleaning products, here is the biggest cost driver in this example. You can go down to this bit here and start to say, okay, well, there's 23 components within that category that are driving the cost there. So you can then start to drill into what does that mean? Where are there opportunities to potentially make decisions on that? It enables much more detail as well when you kind of go into looking at the year in detail here. And you can see over on the right hand side, you've got liability by SKU. So for example, we just pick out this one here, you can start to see that, well, that one SKU is contributing 16% of the overall plastic packaging tax. So that's quite a good place to start to think, actually, where are there some opportunities around that? And then if you then drill into the kind of comparative insights, I haven't got time to go through every piece of it here, but on that particular SKU that I picked up in the previous on the previous page, if you just zoom in on that slide there, you can start to see actually that there's quite a good opportunity, because on this diagram here, you can see that the plastic recycled content is already at 29%. So it tells you that that product is able to have recycled content incorporated in it, unlike some where, you know, there's issues around food contact that I'm sure some people on this call will have encountered that issue at the moment. But in this case, you know, you can see that that SKU has already got recycled content in it, so there's clearly an opportunity to incorporate it. So actually, if you focus in on that and increase that, then, you know, there's £107,000 saving that can be made relatively easily. I caveat the word easily because I appreciate it's not that easy to make those changes, but you hopefully get the idea from that illustration. And then there's various other scenarios you can model, like in the first slide that I showed, that can be edited. So you see, kind of building on what Alice presented, that you can start to be able to model various different scenarios and opportunities, as well as all the headaches and the costs that come with this, that hopefully it can maybe drive some positive change, or at least give your business the opportunity to mitigate some of those costs. So I'll just stop sharing now, and I think I'm not sure how we're doing for time. We had a couple of poll questions, so I don't know if we want to come onto that or dive into. Yeah, Alice, if you want to just share a couple of poll questions, then we should have time for some Q&A.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, John. Yeah, so if you haven't used Slido before, that's fine. We're just going to go to the side to let it load. Oh. Okay. Okay, for some reason that's not.
I think it's working. Just stay on the first one. Yes, okay. I don't know if anyone's used Slido before. You can scan the QR code or just go to slido.com and enter that code, and then you should be able to click on the answer. Hopefully it'll work. Maybe give it. Oh, here we go. Working.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just give it another minute. So.
Here we go. Okay, 10 more seconds.
Yeah, I think so. There's only sort of 11 logged on, so
the numbers are going up. Numbers are going up.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. That's probably about what we're seeing even in our own customer base, because it's such a big change, jumping from what lots of people have been used to and businesses are used to suddenly this, and then some of the other requirements that we're seeing. Great. Do you want to move on to the next one? So we added this question because we're quite interested to understand where some of the barriers are, because some of the clients we're working with are in a position to be adding and including recycled content, and others aren't, and some of the barriers to that, you know, will vary. So it's really useful at this stage to kind of get a bit of a feel, because certainly there's lots of frustration, understandably, from businesses who are saying, well, that's great that we can, you know, that there's a plastics tax, but actually we're not in a position to do anything about it, so we just have to take the hit on it. And then where does that money go? Is it actually being reinvested in recycling or not? And you know, I'd suggest that there's a big question mark over that.
I'm just.
Maybe give. Oh.
Hiya, I just wanted to butt in, actually. Isabel Savage, thinking about tax and thinking about John, I love the slides where you were showing the data, sort of the granularity you could get to in terms of what products were causing most of the problems for, you know, the SKU lines were causing the problems for the tax. And I suppose just thinking about our clients and I suppose just thinking about a little bit of a shining light in amongst this is where people are spending money, maybe spending time looking at their product lines, working out which ones they could be doing something about the packaging and the level of recycled content, whether we're just trying to reduce packaging, whether we're trying to find alternatives, whether we are just upping the recycled content, that just don't forget that that sort of cost, whether it's internal staff costs or whether we're paying people to help us, could well qualify for R&D tax relief. That's a real tax, not like this tax. And this is where we might get a little bit of help for the efforts that we're trying to make. I totally get. I love the fact that you brought out the difference between saving plastic and actually the carbon footprints. I thought that was really, really useful. And for people that are trying to make those efforts, I suppose it's a balance of all of it. But yes, it was just a little bit of a plug that the upside is if you're spending time and efforts trying to reduce either your plastic packaging tax or truly just the plastic content, think about R&D tax relief. That was that. Thank you.
That's really useful, and I think it's quite a good example of why, you know, Ecosurety are partnering up with Bishop Fleming on this, because we wouldn't have known that. Maybe our CFO would have known that, but I certainly wouldn't. And you know, that's really useful, and it's these sort of two worlds converging on the plastics tax. So yeah, that's useful. Is there one more, Alice?
Yeah.
You know.
Oh, sorry. There it is, but for some reason.
I know it's this. So I think this is just multiple choice. We might not have much time to do it, but if anyone wanted to, maybe just in 30 seconds, just chuck down any thoughts on challenges that they're facing. More than happy for people to kind of get in touch with us or the guys at Bishop Fleming with some thoughts on that, because you know, certainly one of the areas we're interested in as a business, we're very connected with the recycling sector. That's kind of our bread and butter, and we're really keen to look at where are there challenges and where are there potentially solutions, either through accessing recycled content, or actually is it just you know, the product we're selling is packaging for food and we can't incorporate recycled content yet. So what's the roadmap like on that? Because we haven't got time today, but there's lots of developments around new recycling technologies such as chemical recycling, which, you know, is seen as a big part of the solution, but it's just not quite there yet. And equally, getting material collected, flexible plastic, for example, is another area of opportunity. But again, it's going to take a year or two, so it's not really in line with the tax going live. That's really interesting. Number of new schemes coming in to overlap PRN, DRS, plastic packaging tax. Yeah, that's kind of linking to the legislation overview slide, where, you know, we're sort of right in the thick of this and understand it's really hard for companies. It was a headache, you know, doing the sort of PRN reporting, and now you've kind of got all these other complexities and uncertainties because lots of that legislation is not even, you know, finalised yet. So that's really useful, just getting that bit of insight.
Cool, thanks, John. I suppose while all these answers are coming through, while people are getting the chance to answer that, we'll just jump into the Q&A so we can make sure we can get to your questions. I know we've got 3 questions here from Nick, so I'll just cover those off first. I think they might be more appropriate for you, Louisa. So is packaging material for protection included? So stuff like bubble wrap?
Yeah, so one of the criteria for the definition of packaging is if it's protecting a good. So yeah, bubble wrap would definitely be in scope. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. That's nice and easy. And then there's a question. Nick's also got that they are a distributor, so obviously import thousands of different products from hundreds of different manufacturers. Who is actually responsible for the tax?
Well, even if they kind of are a distributor, it will depend who is on the import, who's listed on the import document. So if it's, you know, that company on the importation document, then HMRC will assume that they're liable. As I mentioned in the presentation, if you can evidence that you don't actually own the packaging and you're importing it on behalf of another company who would be liable, then you'll have to provide HMRC with evidence that you are kind of the go-between, if you like, and not actually the importer. So yeah, so it's probably worth checking exactly who's listed on the consignee documentation. And if it's that company who's the distributor, have a look to see what evidence you can provide that you don't actually own the packaging, if that's the case. Which might be a simpler solution, considering that they're importing hundreds of different parts, etc.
Brilliant. And then the final one from Nick there is that his business is a UK subsidiary of an EU-owned group, and can the responsibility for the UK subsidiary pass to the EU parents, or does it have to be administered in the UK?
No, so non-resident UK companies are also liable, can be liable for the tax. So if it makes sense in the group structure that the EU parent company becomes the liable taxable party, then they'll have to take on responsibility to pay the tax for all of the companies underneath that umbrella company. But there's no, HMRC are assume that there'll be plenty of companies that are importing into the UK that don't have a UK base, and they will still be liable for the tax as UK-based businesses.
Brilliant, that's great. And do we know who HMRC is going to be monitoring compliance? Is there going to be a separate team just monitoring plastic packaging tax, or is it going to be do we know if it's going to be done by the existing teams that are already pretty busy?
I'm not 100%, but I think they do. They will have their kind of a separate compliance team. In terms of what that compliance will involve, it's essentially all their powers have been lifted from the Finance Act. So all of the powers that they have to enforce other taxes like VAT will apply to the plastic packaging tax. So there'll be, civil and criminal penalties, etc. Sorry, I'm not entirely sure on that one, but I think they will have a dedicated enforcement team within HMRC. It's probably worth noting that they have said that in the first year of the tax, they understand it's a new tax for businesses, and businesses might have found it really difficult to become completely prepared ahead of April. So enforcement will be more kind of understanding in the first year while the tax kind of beds down, and importers and manufacturers start getting the right data in the course of the next year.
That's going to be the biggest. That's going to be the biggest soundbite from this.
Yeah. Not saying that you should obviously comply with the regulations, but they'll be understanding that it's a new tax and a new system to kind of get your head around.
I was just going to add to that. Sorry, that's true what Louise is saying, but I guess as a general thought that we probably assume that going forward after that kind of grace period, if you want to call it that, is that you could probably assume that HMRC will be more proactive, I suppose, than typically we've seen the Environment Agency be for anyone who's a producer at the moment under the packaging regulations. There are audits from the EA, but historically they've not been that aggressive or proactive, whereas you can probably safely assume that HMRC will be more proactive.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
No, grace. Always good when there's a bit of a grace period. Brilliant. And then I'll just got time for just one more question from a bakery who wrap some of their products in plastic film, but they're not the importer or the manufacturer. Is it right that they don't have to pay the tax, or will they have to pay something?
No, their manufacturer, if based in the UK, will pay the tax, or if not, if they get their packaging imported by imported packaging, it'll be the importer. Even though they won't be directly liable to pay the tax, it's probably worth talking to your plastic packaging supplier, because they will be thinking about increasing costs. And it might even be that they haven't heard of the tax and they won't pay the tax, in which case the bakery might be found liable if the actual taxable business has failed to pay the tax. So it's worth to kind of checking in with them to see by how much they're going to raise their prices to account for the tax, and B, if they are fully informed of the regulations as well.
Brilliant. No, thanks everybody. No, that's all we've got time for questions, but thanks ever so much for popping those in the chat. We'll get back to any of those ones we haven't answered already. But no, thank you ever so much for joining. I hope you found it really useful. Certainly my main take home point from it all is just how important good quality data is going to be in making sure that you're paying the right amount of tax going forward. So I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. If you do have any further questions, do just get in touch with any of the team here at Bishop Fleming or Ecosurety, and we hope to see you soon.